Okay, so welcome, and I appreciate you taking the time on a Monday afternoon to be here with me. Oh, hi, Holly. So I'm supposed to keep track of who's here because Linda tracks it. So I've got Holly, Shelley, Tanya, and Colette. Is that Chelsea? My Chelsea? Okay. Welcome. Yay, I love it when I've got lots of humans on the class. Holly says I'm not human today. Okay, so if you have something to say, you're like, it doesn't have to just be typed. You can jump in and we can actually hear your voice, which is always nice as well, instead of just listening to me. So this is the reason I tied these two subjects together of transaction brokerage and counteroffers was really to, I could talk about lots of things for a long time at any given point, but I wanted to make sure that, these are sort of two big issues. I think we can get through them both pretty quickly, but I also want to make sure I've got time for questions because there's a lot of confusion that's happening now with respect to both. So I thought what I would do is I would start with transaction brokerage. Somebody's phone is ringing or something. I don't know what I'm hearing. Please tell me other people can hear this. It's not just me. I don't know who that was. Susan's here now. Welcome. Mary Lee, welcome. So I thought what I would do is I would start with transaction brokerage because it's probably the most dangerous of areas, is what I'm going to call it. And in the sense of the easiest place to get in trouble, especially in a designated office. So let's start with a quick overview. Welcome, Allison. Sort of, first of all, when we should even be considering transaction brokerage, because that's the first part that gets really confusing. So what used to happen, now I have, oh, Monica's there too. This is exciting. Look at all these people I'm writing down. So for a lot of people who had previously been with common law brokerages, so automatically anybody that's been licensed more than about 6 years, you're sort of automatically have that background because designated really wasn't around. I think it was 6 or 7 years ago it started. I'm not 100% sure, but not that much longer than that. And so a lot of us have what I call the common law baggage that we drag with us, and there's a lot of people who are functioning as designated agents, but still sort of, honestly, still a bit like a common law agent, only that they're designated when it's convenient. And so the first thing we need to do is to really just identify when we should be in transaction brokerage and who qualifies to be in transaction brokerage. So in our past life, or anyone who is in common law who's aware of this, for the newly licensed people, we don't have this, but I just want to give some overall context. We used to be in something called limited dual agency, and what it meant was as soon as you did a double end or represented a buyer in any capacity, you immediately put them into what was called limited dual agency, which basically is sort of close to the transaction brokerage we have now. And it was because the whole office had agency. It didn't matter if I sold your listing, Marc-Andre, and I've never met your sellers or know anything about it. I still had to act as if I did. Welcome, Anita. And so in the past, that's what we all did. And so what happened was when we went into designated agency, everybody still sort of treated sign calls and open house people as if they were clients. Okay. And then at the same time, you've got people saying to you, oh, well, the minute you meet a human, you have to put them under buyer designated. So that's not true either. So I'll hopefully clear that piece up for you as well. So the first part is when we're in designated agency, we represent one party at a time. Okay? So if you are representing a seller, which is 99.9% of the time this matters, and I'm going to, Anita's in my eye line, so I'm going to pick on Anita. So Anita calls me on a sign or emails me off of something and says, oh my gosh, I would really love to see your listing at 123 Smith Street. And you go, great. So after I ask her if she has a realtor and she says no, and I say, okay, great. So we book the appointment and we go look at the house, and I make sure she understands that I'm here, here to show you the house, but you remember that I do represent the seller, so don't tell me anything you don't want me to know, and et cetera, et cetera. So then she goes away, loves the house, comes back with mom, I don't know, they want to offer, okay? So do you think that Anita is a customer or a client? Okay, so I have two customers in person here. Anita, what do you think? Treat them as a customer is what somebody's saying. Any of my online people have an opinion? Customer. Okay, so the answer is yes, they're a customer. But the question is, why are they a customer? Because you represent the seller, but why else? So Allison, who is extremely far away from the microphone right now, is saying because you don't have an established relationship with that person, and you have an established relationship with the seller, and she is 1,000% correct. So when that happens, basically, in order to be a client, now that person could choose to be a client. They could choose to not buy this house, and they love you, and you go off shopping and you look for something else. Great, you have officially picked up a client. And once they actually want you to start advising them, then you would get them to hire you, which is when you sign your BDBA, and off you go your merry way to look at other houses. Okay? The reality is that probably 98% of the time someone calls you on a sign or reaches out to you in some way off a listing, they don't actually buy your listing, they buy something else. Fair? But it does happen when this human goes, oh, I would really like your house. And you're like, great. So to determine whether or not someone can be in transaction brokerage, there's a couple of things. The bar is very high, okay? So the first thing is that you must be in a pre-existing client relationship. So the person who calls you on the sign or walks into an open house is not someone with whom, unless it's one of your existing buyers who's under contract or you are at that stage of you're about to sign them, they're a client. Does that make sense to everybody? So if you're giving advice and they've hired you and don't want to talk to any other humans and you've been working with them and showing them houses, they're a client. So they technically qualify to enter into transaction brokerage. If it is someone whom you've never met, they walk in, they call you, they show up, they book an appointment, and they want to write, they are not a client. You are there to be a facilitator, and they would be a customer. So there's another bar. So not only do they have to be an existing client, they also have to be of the same sophistication level as the seller. Now, everybody always thinks, oh, the poor little first-time home buyer, they should never be in transaction brokerage. Well, you have some sellers who are not as sophisticated as the buyers. You could have someone who has never sold a house except for this one time. They don't know what they're doing. You could have someone who's a senior citizen and has lived in this house for 65 years. And then you've got a bunch of people that flip houses that want to be the buyer. The seller's not as experienced as the buyer. It's not always the buyer is the poor innocent one. We've all worked with sellers who really need you to hold their hand. Is that a fair statement? Okay. So not only do they have to be an existing client, but they need to be on the same par to be able to function with getting no advice. Because when you enter into transaction brokerage, you become a facilitator on both sides. So let's talk about how this changes what happens for the buyer and the seller. So when you enter into transaction brokerage, what happens to the buyer? Can anybody tell me what is the difference between a customer and being a client under transaction brokerage? Anybody? Someone speak up online if they'd like to. Anybody have anything?
Can you say the question again?
Okay, my question is,
what's the difference?
When you're a buyer and I'm a customer, or when I'm a buyer and I'm in transaction brokerage, what is the difference for me?
In transaction brokerage, you don't get any representation, and I can't do any negotiation for you or anything like that.
Okay, and what about when I'm a customer?
A customer, in transaction brokerage?
No, a customer. When I'm what's the difference between me being a customer or a buyer in transaction brokerage?
Good question.
So, hang on, Anita. Wait.
I'm just saying, I don't think there's much difference because in a customer relationship, you're working for your client. Let's say they're on your seller's side. As a customer, you're basically doing up the documentation for them. You're passing things back and forth. You have to go back to the client if you need to disclose anything. Basically, you're just kind of doing up paperwork for them also, and also giving them comparables. But if you're in transaction brokerage, I think that would be the same for both sides, though.
That's not what I asked. My question was, as a buyer, what is the difference for me between being a customer or being a transaction brokerage? And Anita is saying nothing. Anybody else?
You got that the full duty of care that you give to your client that you won't give to the customer.
When you have duty of care regardless of your relationship. That transcends agency. So, because you can't act unlawfully or in the harm of any human, no matter whether they're customer or not. So, as a buyer, do you think it makes really any difference to me if I'm a customer or in transaction? My opinion as your broker is no. All I'm doing is facilitating to the buyer under either circumstance. In either circumstance, I'm going to say, you need to consult an expert. You need to talk to your lawyer. You need to, you want to hire an appraiser if you're not sure. That's what I'm going to say. You have to come closer, or I have to walk over every time. So she's saying you're protecting yourself more.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it helps the buyer at all, either one of those situations.
Well, the difference is there's really no change in the status of that person, whether or not they're a customer or they're in transaction brokerage when they're a buyer. So let's talk about what happens to the seller from you being their listing agent to entering into transaction brokerage. What happens to the seller? So Allison is saying that the seller loses their agency, which means what? Right, so she's saying you started off listing them as their listing agent and advising them, and once you put into transaction, you have to stop doing that. So if I was a seller and I actually understood what this meant, do you think any sellers would ever sign a transaction brokerage?
No. I think some people will, if they're very experienced.
Right.
But they're thinking, what do we have to find a home, want to work.
Well, if they want the question is if they want representation or not, right? So the key to understand is the key to understanding the difference is, number one, is your seller comfortable proceeding with you as purely a facilitator versus I've been talking to you and confiding in you and asking for your input for this long 6-month journey, and now you're going to tell me that you can't advise me. So that seller has to be really comfortable that they know where they're going. Okay? So, Denise, can you hear now? Yes, okay. So, so they need to be very comfortable actually proceeding. But here's the reality. If we first go through the test to determine whether or not a buyer should even be in transaction brokerage, there are very few instances where the buyer actually qualifies to be in transaction brokerage versus being a customer. Okay? So, let's assume that we do have a situation where it's a pre-existing client, or I'm in a small town and and it's very hard to, to divide that, or it's a repeat client and we have an existing relationship and we've been out looking for houses and lo and behold, the one they want is mine. Great, right? So what we used to do, and I've done it, I've done it, everybody's done it, and anyone that tells you they haven't done it, lying. We would sit with the buyer. We would say, this is what's going to happen. We're going to put you in transaction brokerage. We're going to write up the offer. You tell me what you want me. Don't tell me anything you want me to know, but I'm going to write it up, and I'm going to draft the transaction, and I'm going to go and sit with my seller, and I'm going to bring them the transaction brokerage, and I'm going to bring them the offer. That's how we did it. We did them at the same time. Fair? Everybody's done this, right? Yes. So we would go sit with our seller and say, so remember, we talked about this possibility when I listed you that this could happen. Well, yay, today's the day. I have an offer for you. And, obviously I'm not going to do anything to harm you, and I'm not going to do anything to harm them because I don't want to lose my license. And, here we go. Let's look at the offer. That's kind of how we did it. Is that fair? Does that sort of sound like the average listing presentation with a transaction? Like presentation of an offer? Okay, so that's what we did because, I don't know, it's what we did. It's what we were taught. It's how we did it. So now we have figured out that when we do that, we are actually not giving our sellers a choice. We are literally saying, if you would like this offer, so Anka, we'll come back to your buyer designated. So you'll come back to your question. And so what would happen is, but even when you were in common law, I'm just going to go back because Anka is a new member of KW. Welcome. Yay, welcome. And so she came from a common law brokerage. So in the past, you would have technically had the same option to make a buyer a customer and not use the buyer designated. It would have been the same. You just didn't have to do that. But in most common law brokerages, they never taught people how to make buyers customers. Okay? So the first thing that you need to do is so let's say Marc-Andre is the buyer, and I've explained my agency relationship to him, and I say, okay, so now before we write your offer, what was the key word that I just said there? Before we write your offer, we are going to prepare a transaction brokerage agreement and make sure we give the seller the option to determine how they wish to proceed. They may be comfortable proceeding with me as a facilitator because of the relationship we have, but there might be circumstances in which they're not. And if that's the case, then I am then going to either be able to treat you as a customer in terms of the technical relationship we set up. So I know you're an existing client, but I need to switch that relationship. Or if you really truly are not comfortable with that, then I can refer you to someone in-house who will fully represent you for this transaction. And if for some reason it doesn't come together, then we will go back together and go shopping. Okay? So I hope nobody just fell down. That's what it sounded like. So now, this doesn't have to happen over like a 3-day period. This could be half an hour, right? So you meet with your buyer, potential buyer, you write up the transaction brokerage agreement, you send it over to Mary, the homeowner, okay? And you explain to her, again, at that time, this is what this means, and this is how it affects you, and this is the transaction, before they've seen the offer, so that they are not pressured or pushed or shoved into that relationship, okay? So let's say they say, yes, I am prepared to enter a transaction brokerage because this is a past client of yours and you're in a relationship, et cetera, et cetera. So you go, okay, great, perfect. I will now go back to the buyer and let them know, and then I will draft their offer. Okay? So then you will draft that offer, and then you would then present the offer to the seller, and you will still explain everything to the seller the same way you would if you were advising them, but when they say to you, so what price should I go back at? You're like, well, you need to tell me a number. Like, where do you want to be? You can't say, well, I think we should go back and we should hammer that. We can't do any of that. Okay? So this could happen within half an hour. This could happen within 5 hours. It could happen within 15 minutes. You could have people in 2 rooms. Like, there's lots of different ways to do it. But the idea is if a seller says no, I am really uncomfortable with this, and I'm the one paying you, so I want advice. Right? So that
the ringleader.
you have to, Allison, you either have to come in or I have to walk over to you because people can't hear online.
So really, the seller is dictating what we should do.
Absolutely. We have a pre-existing duty of care contract, listing agreement, fiduciary obligations to that seller, and they get to decide whether or not, right? Whether or not you're going to move into transaction, right? So, but again, here's the difference. For a buyer, it really doesn't change their experience. Because even a buyer who's a client, if you switched them into customer status, they're not getting any more advice from you than they would in transaction. So in a lot of cases, it might be better to amend your buyer designated agreement to pause it, make them a customer for the one offer. If it doesn't come together, then you change it back over. Because it changes nothing for the buyer, but it changes everything for the seller. Now, one of the other ones that gets a little more complicated, and that's why I'm thrilled that I have so many of you online with me today, is when you have somebody who wants to buy your listing with a sale of purchaser's property offer and they want you to list their house. Did I lose you again? So I have the house listed at 123 Smith Street. Anita, Mary the buyer, walks into my open house, is considering buying my listing, but she needs to sell her house first and would like me to come do a listing presentation. This happens a lot. This is one of the most common questions that I get on this. So I'm going to give you an opinion, which is kind of what I do, but you get to do what you want ultimately, depending on the circumstance. So I do not personally believe that any buyer can navigate a sale of purchaser's property offer as a customer. I really do not believe that they can. There are way too many complications, timings, how do I position myself, how do I move, how do I do that I don't personally believe, with very few exceptions, that a buyer is capable of dealing with an SOBP as a client or as a customer. So if that happened, my personal suggestion would be that you would go list their house and you would refer them for the offer purposes only on that subject property to a teammate. Now please remember, you guys get to negotiate how you compensate each other. There's no rule. So if I splat a buyer in your lap, Allison, and say, look, they're ready to go, they're pre-approved, I showed them the house, I need you to write the offer, I'm listing the house, I can arrange whatever financial division I choose. And I would then amend my buyer designated, I would have that buyer under buyer designated, amend the buyer designated to say Allison Godso is going to represent Susie and Bobby for the purposes of the offer on 123 Smith Street. If that offer doesn't come together, then this amendment is void, and they go back to me. So she only has them under her BDBA would only be for that street, for that specific house. Okay. Have I lost you guys online? Okay. No, sort of, Holly. A little Anka, that's fine. I'll explain more to you as we go. So here's the thing. So in those situations, this is where your moral compass is really your guide. Okay? So the other piece of this is what happens a lot, and I had this conversation, I think 3 days ago with somebody, and it was about the situation. They had been called to go, someone had looked at the house, they thought they were going to write an offer, and they wanted the agent to go to a listing appointment. So the conversation that I had with our team member of KW was to say, okay, I think you're about 10 steps ahead. Because 90% of the time, I would say higher than that, 95% of the time, you're going to go to the house. So let's say Allison is my buyer who walked into my open house and wants me to, thinks she might want to write on this, but needs to sell her house first and has invited me to do a listing appointment. So I go to Allison's house and I'm like, okay, we start talking about numbers and we start trying to figure out how we're going to do this and figure out, well, number one, she can't carry 2 houses. Number two, can't afford to risk $800 on sewer inspections and building inspections should they get kicked out of an SOBP. So my advice to her is probably going to be that I think we should list the house first and wait and come back to the house later. Okay? Hang on, I don't know who was talking.
Let's go to meeting and that's supposed to be able to
Who's
speak
talking?
in.
Sorry, who's talking? And I can't hear you. Was that Holly? Whoever was talking, I'm now. Linda needs to mute. I think Linda asked. Does somebody have a question? I'm going to carry on. Someone can type it in if they have a question, and I'll answer it, I guess. So my advice to our member of KW was to say, I think the advice about them writing on this property should be the same as you would give any potential seller on writing on any other property. Take your listing out of the equation. If I was sitting with you as a homeowner, Allison, as to whether or not you can financially carry both houses, are you prepared for this risk? Are you prepared to pay for inspections up front and lose the house? Would I give you the same advice if it was a RE/MAX listing as if it was my listing? The answer should be yes, right? So sometimes we get very worried about how this is all going to play out. We've got all these scenarios and everybody's very stressed about it, but there are very few buyers who are financially capable of actually potentially risking $500 to $1,000 in inspections that the seller is going to want done first, right? And or are capable of carrying 2 houses and that type of thing. So sometimes we don't actually need to worry about this, but we do before. I get the call in the in-between. I get the call between they think they want to write and, oh, can you price my house? And in most cases, it becomes a moot point and they never write. They might write later, but at that point, you're truly in transaction brokerage because you've actually been representing both sellers. Okay? It's really complicated, and I know that, and that there's no really easy. Wait.
No, it's just because I'm thinking about being on the seller side, who all of a sudden they find out that you have a buyer and they're going to write subject to sale, right? And you're turning around and saying to that buyer, well, I don't think that you should write it subject to sale of your house because of all those other circumstances, right? So in some respects, you're letting down your seller.
Well, I agree and I disagree at the same time, because my personal opinion would be that the random human who walked into my open house that told me they might want to write a deal, until I've met them or have any idea if they're pre-qualified or have they have a house to sell, is it even saleable? I don't know that I'd be getting my seller all wound up and excited, but that's a personal style perhaps of how you manage your business.
And it depends on how your seller will react.
Right, and you might say to them, look, I met someone, they're interested, this is the situation, right? And even so, even if they wrote the offer, you could still potentially refer them out for the offer. There's lots of different scenarios, okay? The end result is we need to, I want you to think about the risk that this is the most risky situation we can be in, isn't it? So we have a couple of questions here. So you were saying if this happens, we should do the listing first, then make the offer on both clients and no. It would depend on whether or not the offer is going to be SOBP or if the offer is later and clean.
So you're saying yes to do the listing first and make the offer?
If they're SOBP, no. Then I personally wouldn't put a. Okay, wait a minute. Now I'm confusing myself. Okay, so let's say the buyer wants to write on an SOBP, okay, you would need to have a conversation with that new seller / buyer. My personal opinion is that offer should have a partner involved to represent them on the negotiation side of the purchase. I think it's too complicated. That's an opinion. Can you do it? Yes. Do you want to have 1,000 notes documenting every step and every conversation you've had with people to make sure that they can't later say that you weren't, it's very complicated to do an SOBP without advice, right? So yes, you can do it, but in a lot of cases, what I'm trying to explain in this scenario is in so many cases, the whole conversation becomes moot because the people can't afford to carry both houses. They can't afford to pay inspections and lose them. So they can't actually write in a lot of cases. Does this make sense to people? But if they did, and they're comfortable being a customer, if you've explained and you've documented, you can do it. But there's not a lot of people. Most people think they can do an SOBP and they don't have to do anything until their house sells. They don't need financing approval. They don't need to do inspections. They don't need to do any of that because it's conditional offer. But sellers are not accepting that anymore. They want inspections done. They want to know that everything else is good except the house being sold. So the deals themselves have become more complicated. So let's go back. Number one, the bar for being a transaction brokerage means an existing client relationship and that the buyers and sellers are at a fairly strong equal experience level. I'm not talking education because I'm talking about, one hasn't lived in the house for 75 years and, the other person's a house flipper, right? Or vice versa, the first-time home buyers who, literally, they've never even rented a place. They're literally going from mom's house to your offer and, first jobs and really have no clue. Could you honestly sleep at night thinking that they've got no advice? Can't even tell them how to negotiate after the building inspection. Like you can't even tell them what to offer. So that's when the hard pill to swallow is to say, I may actually make less money on this one transaction. Because let's be honest, the whole reason that this agency thing has come up is because of litigation and problems with people being sued or people being driven by the commissions and forgetting about the needs of the humans in the middle of this. I'm a believer that the bigger picture will come back to you. If I said to Allison, this situation is so complicated and from what you've already told me, this is a risk. I would honestly feel better if I had to sell my house and I needed to hire someone, I would hire Anita. So I would like Anita to represent you for the offer of this. I'm still going to sell your house, whatever, but she's going to help you fight against the sellers, which I can't do, right? Just like you wouldn't want me fighting against you. So I'm prepared to, to do that and bring her in and make sure she looks after you. And if it doesn't work and that deal falls or you get kicked out of the deal, then when the time comes, I'm going to be the one that takes you shopping because we're not going to be buying my listing that time. So when you take that position of truly looking after your clients, you don't lose your clients here, guys, right? And it's important that you know how to amend your agreements in order based on the individual circumstances. So that's when you will call me and we will figure out based on that particular circumstance exactly what the wording needs to be. Just going to go up a little bit here because Anka had a couple of questions. So she is saying, because you always find the questions help everybody. So, so number one, you came from common law and never did buyer designated. Well, the good news is that every brokerage in the province now is required to do buyer agreements. If you're common law, as of January 1, buyer common law agency agreements are now in place. So every buyer everywhere in the province will be in some form of something, okay? So we'll just teach you our ways now. So you have, can you deal with clients from Germany only as clients? Absolutely. Absolutely, you can deal with
as customers.
As customers? You said as clients.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I type with one finger. No, the problem is we might talk about that. It's a special situation. I don't think it actually adds to here because I have a lot to do with sellers and buyers from Germany, and there is a tricky thing with the customer relationship.
Okay, so we can chat about that. That's a bit more of a specific thing.
Yeah.
But again, the end result is typically when you find a partner in-house that you trust and you're confident with, it becomes a very reciprocal thing. So even though you might feel like you lost commission on X deal, maybe you do it at a 50-50 split. Nobody says it has to be 25. It's up to you guys what you do. We are not going to tell you how to manage your businesses or your finances. But then that same partner runs into the same situation and they hand you back a deal. So guess what? You're right back to the same place and you can put your head down on your pillow at night and not want to vomit that you don't know what you've done. Okay? So I'm just going to move back so I'm current with the questions there. Okay. So just to recap, so transaction brokerage is a very specific thing. Now, obviously, it has to be on only your own listing. So just for Anka and anybody else who's on the room, in the chat room with us, that's previously common law, it's only your listings. Within KW, you stay as clients. So if I sell one of Allison's listings or one of Marc Andre's listings, everybody's clients. There's no problem. I don't need to take away any of my rights from anybody in order to sell an in-house listing. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, we want to be in a pre-existing client relationship. So if I see your BDBA is signed at exactly the same loop time as your offer, you are not in an existing client relationship. So let's be very clear. The commission is going to start looking at times and dates. It can be half an hour, but if it's 5 minutes, they're not buying it. They know what's going on. They're aware. But, and especially with the transaction brokerage, if the transaction brokerage is signed at exactly the same time, and it shows that it went, like say you're using .loop, and the transaction brokerage went in the same loop and signed, then you didn't, with the offer, then you didn't present it in advance. Like I'm saying, it could be half an hour. Your clients maybe only need just physically time to sign it. They're fine with it. But if it happens at the same time, then we're holding the offer hostage. Fair? Okay. So the transaction brokerage has to be sent ahead of time. It should be sent before you physically drafted the offer. Because if that buyer says, you know, I was okay with transaction because you're not advising anybody, so I feel equal. But now that you're going to be advising the seller and not advising me, that's the only real difference. I actually would like my own representation. You're not going to write the offer. Does that make sense? So if it's pre-drafted, how's that supposed to work? Okay, so technically it should be done before, like completely before, not just sent before, agreed upon before you draft the offer. So you could send have your buyer sign the transaction brokerage, working with a realtor, blah, 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 that you already have you working with a realtor in your BDBA because they're an existing client. And so then we do our transaction brokerage and I'll go, okay, so I'll let you know what they say. So assuming they say yes, then we will connect in as soon as I have it back, we'll draft your offer. If they say no, then these are your choices. Okay. So that is maybe, if I should correct myself, the potentially only difference to a buyer is if they choose to, as a customer or a client, is that you are technically sort of neutral between the two. Then you're not, when you're a customer, you're very much on the side of the seller. From a practical perspective, there's not a big difference. But if somebody really feels they want advice, you need to not have drafted their offer. Because you know too much then, right?
I find too that a lot of buyers are contacting. This situation I just had, a buyer contacted on a listing, took her 3 times to the house. Everything was good. My seller was fine. She was fine. And then she must have spoke to somebody. And then you get the call. I decided I'm going to get my own representation. And sometimes I feel like that's a big weight off my shoulder because I'm like, I think I've done what I can with the fine lines, but then it's kind of like a kick in the teeth, like, oh, I just took you there 3 times.
Well, but you look at that is that you've done, if by you showing the house, because you represent your seller best, and you talk about your listings better than a buyer, if that closed the deal to get it sold for your seller, then it's a kick in the teeth that pays.
Totally.
Right?
Totally agree with
Yeah. So sometimes we get caught on that. It's the same thing as, you know, buyers who will call you and they're like, you know, you find out after because they lie. They have an agent, but their agent was busy. So they asked you to show.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, it is what it is. It's the nature of the industry. If you sell the house and you've done your duty for your seller, then that's all you can do.
That's what we're working on.
That's what you're working for. Okay. So does anybody have any other questions on transaction brokerage before I move on? Oh, wait. So maybe agree over the phone and only sign transaction. No. How much weight does verbal have in real estate? None. That one's not going to fly, I'm afraid, Susan. Because they have to read, like unless you actually, like there's wording in the transaction brokerage that very clearly states what you're taking away, and that's why they want them to have seen it and signed it. Now, I'm going to add one other complicated piece to this just before we move on, which is please remember for any industry members who represent builders, you can never be in transaction brokerage, ever, 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 when representing the builder. You can in other situations. I don't mean, like, so if you sell for a builder, you can never, ever be in transaction brokerage with a potential customer or consumer. And if you ever sell your own listing, your own house, which I don't recommend, but that's a different conversation because it's not covered by E&O, but you can also never be in transaction brokerage and be the principal in any real estate.
That's common.
You would think it's common sense, but the reason that we get reminded of it is because it's not, okay? So they consider a builder to be an established relationship, and this is going to sound really terrible, but the cow that just keeps milking, so you are absolutely never going to not favor that person that is continuing to hand you business, even if it's at a weird commission level, it doesn't matter. If you are in transaction brokerage, can you still go to inspection for buyer and just not advise? Absolutely. So now let's be clear on the difference between explaining and advising. So if you're working with a customer or in transaction brokerage and they're like, well, I don't understand what this clause means. Well, of course you can explain it. You're supposed to explain real estate terms. You're supposed to explain real estate procedures. But if you're at the building inspection and they're like, so do you think I should ask them for the hot water heater? You're like, so, you know, it's up to you to decide how much you want to ask for, and, you know, you think about it, you let me know, and I will write it up. So you actually need to be present because you actually cannot ever let a human into a building inspection that is unsupervised by an industry member, number one. So, yes, you have to be there because you still are technically representing them as a facilitator, okay? Any other questions on transaction brokerage before your brains blow up? Okay, so if you think of something else.
Yeah, I have a quick one.
Sure, who's talking? Anke. Okay, yep.
Anke. In the past, I always did it that way. If I had a seller, they always keep being my clients. If I have a buyer, even if I worked with them before, I never had a buyer's agreement before. So
Right.
That's another thing now that's new. But if they want to make an offer on my own listing, I made a customer agreement with them.
And you can
So I always had,
still do that.
and can I still do that? Because I find that I feel much more comfortable not putting my seller suddenly. I have sellers, I have relationships over many years. I just feel completely uncomfortable to tell them, you are now in a so-called transaction. I can't even explain that to Europeans. They just shake their head. You are now in a transaction relationship, and I can't advise you anymore. It's just not working.
As long as the buyer is prepared to go into the customer status. So the difference now, and this wouldn't matter if you were common law or designated now because everybody has agreements. If you have the person as a customer and they're under your agreement, you would just amend the agreement, and we'll show you how to do that, to say, for the purposes of writing on 123
the buyer.
Smith Street, for the purposes of writing on 123 Smith Street, this agreement is considered, on hold, and a buyer-customer status will be signed. So you would sign the buyer-customer status for that property. If that deal doesn't come together,
Mm-hmm.
you don't need to do anything because the other one terminates if that deal comes together.
Yeah, I feel totally I feel illoyal to my sellers, which I have a close relationship to.
Yeah, no, you can do it. It's just a question
With
of what.
transactions. So I like to do that much better.
Yep, that's no problem. Does anybody else have a question?
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about counteroffers right now because I don't know how many times I get calls from agents. So this is something that we haven't regularly taught because it's kind of the thing that some of the brokers knew, not all of the brokers knew or still know. It was kind of like this sort of like underlying thing that was there, but nobody talked about it. So what it is the when can I counter, how can I counter, and what happens with the time for acceptance schmozzle. So I get a lot of calls, more so now because now that this is out, people are starting to do it. So I'll get a call. Probably almost everybody on this list of who's participating in the class today at some point has called me about this. And they'll say, I sent over an offer to so-and-so, and it's expired because it was due. They had to answer me by 12 o'clock, and they haven't answered me, and now my deal's dead, and I don't know if they're going to counter. I don't know what they're going to do, and, etc. And so there's this big confusion. So because I'm not a normal human, I know the exact wording of clause 15, which is your offer is open for acceptance until X time on X date. Okay, so what is the key word that I just said? Can anybody tell me? Wendy, you know this one because we had this phone call. Holly, you know this one too. We've had this phone call. Yes, acceptance. It is open for acceptance until noon. So I must accept by noon, but I can counter or reject whenever the flip I want. That is the current wording. Because technically, a counter is a new offer. Technically. So this gets complicated. Okay? So my number one thing that I would get you to start doing when you're working with buyers is to let them know that we're going to send this offer. I've put 5 p.m. So they have to accept this by 5 p.m. They might counter us by the same time, but they might counter us an hour later or 2 hours later. Maybe they have to talk to their bank or, talk to parents. It's overwhelming. They're not sure what to do. It doesn't mean our deal is dead because they can counter. So I recently had an offer where we countered 5 days later because lawyers were involved and back and forth and PIDs and what was going on and blah, 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 blah. So that's when we countered. So you can counter whenever you want. So now this will get people wound up. Now, Holly, I'm going to pick on you for a second. Can I tell our story about your deal? Okay. So Holly had an offer. She was the selling agent. She received an offer, and her clients were away or something. I don't know. It was like on the Friday of the long weekend, and they left it open till like Saturday at noon or something. And all these clients were like in 2 different places or away or something. It doesn't matter. They couldn't answer by the arbitrary time that this buyer's agent had decided. And regardless, they needed to talk to their bank and do whatever. There was no way for them to answer or counter because they needed more information, and it was a long weekend and they couldn't get it. Am I right so far, Holly? Am I remembering correctly? Yep. Okay. So the agent says to her, well, so Holly calls me because the agent's yelling at her. And I said, well, the agent has 2 choices. The agent can just relax because you've already told her you're going to counter, so it doesn't matter what time it says on the offer. Everything is dead because a counter can be rejected, so it makes no difference. Like you've got the offer and you can answer then. Or she can resubmit her offer or resubmit that page 3 with an initial change with a new time and a new date. A text message does not count, an email does not count, a phone call does not count. Okay? But it really doesn't matter because you're countering. Your clients have already instructed you that you're countering, so it doesn't matter. So then the agent says, well, she goes crazy and says, I want you, she tells Holly that she wants her to do an amendment, no, to do a counter offer back to say that the time for acceptance is open till whenever. And so I said to Holly, if you write that counter offer, I will hunt you down. I said, because the counter offer says that I agree to all other terms and conditions of this offer except what is written there. So they would basically have been accepting the offer. Does this make sense to everybody? Yeah. Then she wanted Holly, after Holly said no to that, she called me, then the lady said, well, no, I want you to do an amendment to change the time for acceptance. Well, the last time I checked, you can't amend an agreement that's not an agreement. You can't amend a thing that's not a thing. So I said to Holly, I am telling you, I am 1,000% sure that I'm right. I forget a lot of things, but not my rules. So they need to chillax because there's nothing else they can do. So that's what happened, is it just paused. So when you write an offer, it is open for acceptance until X time. If you counter, please do not write in the counter offer, the time for acceptance is now X if it's past the time it was open till. How many times have you done that or received that? So Anita and I are negotiating, and we go past the time on the original offer. So then suddenly in the counter offer, we write, time for acceptance is now 5 p.m. because we're trying to close a gap. Because that's what we were previously taught to do. You are no longer required to do that because there is no gap. Because you're not accepting, you're countering. Therefore, the time for acceptance is irrelevant because you did not accept the deal you countered. Have I lost everybody online? Wait. Anita.
It's ludicrous because then what is the whole thing about time is of the essence? There is no time of the essence anymore because basically you can just counter whenever you feel like countering.
Well, yes and no.
And then what happens then when your other offers start coming in? What happens at that point?
That's the next question. Okay, so Holly, yes, you're right. Most agents do not understand this. So Anita beautifully, without prompting, segued me into my next point, which is when you are okay, so now everybody's panicking because you're a buyer, right? You're thinking like a buyer, right? But technically, when they present a counter to you, you still don't have a deal till you sign it. It makes no difference whether you sign it now or sign it in 3 hours. Until you get those new terms and you agree to it, you're nowhere. Fair? So now let's be seller's agents for a second. Because I'll tell you, when it's a seller's agent, this is the coolest thing ever. So number one, I get 2 offers in. I get multiple offers in. I can counter one now, see what they say. And if we can't come to terms, I can wait and counter the second one. I don't have to counter them both at the same time because I'm not accepting either. So how cool is that for a seller? You think you agree with me? So now, what else? So let's say Marc-Andre sends me an offer. You won't like this as a buyer's agent. This part you'll love as a seller's agent. You won't like it as a buyer's agent. So Marc-Andre sends me an offer, and it's open for acceptance till 5 p.m. today. And I'm like, well, this is a giant pile of crap. Sorry. Oops. This is terrible. And we're going to counter, right? We are going to counter, right? We're not accepting this. We're going to counter. But I can counter whenever I want, right? So at 5 o'clock, I get another offer. I can take it. And I can present that to my seller. And then I can decide what I'm doing. And I can create a multiple offer later. So this is a miserable thing when you are a buyer. Just going to be honest, it's miserable. But when you are a seller, wow, are you empowering your seller? That's the reality of it. Do the people online, are they with me? Have I completely confused you? Yes. Wow, interesting. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's complicated. Okay, it's very complicated. I can't fully explain this in all of the minutia in an hour. An hour and a half. The reason I'm giving you a little tiny piece of this is because I want you to have the power when representing your clients as to what can happen, how can you advise them, and what are the tools you have in your tool chest that most other agents don't know and don't understand, because they don't. So I will also warn you that you will very likely need to pull me in from time to time to speak to other brokers, because I'm going to tell you there's an incredible amount of brokers who don't know this rule. Now, new forms are coming for the agreement of purchase and sale. I can't remember when. This spring, June, I don't know. So maybe when that form comes out, it won't say the same thing. It won't, and we'll have to have a completely different class. But until that happens, this is the reality. You can counter at any time. So I'll give you an example. This deal that I was talking to you about that took 4 days, the other agent wanted, after we'd signed it, so when we wrote back on the offer and we did our counter and we wrote, when we signed the APS and said this date, which was a completely different date than at the top in clause 15, the other broker called me and said, well, they wanted us to initial, they wanted us to change the time for acceptance and initial it, and I said no. So I'm not doing it because it's not necessary. It's irrelevant. I want to show that there was actually a gap in time. I'm not going to go back and erase history. We're allowed to do this. This is the time. This is how long it took. This is when we countered. So I completely appreciate that this is a very complicated situation. So I'm going to recap, and if you have questions, let me know. So number one, a counter is a new offer, because you have not accepted the offer. You're countering. So it's basically a new offer. The wording in clause 15 says that this offer is open for acceptance until X time. So you must accept it by that time. If you are, let's say there's an hour delay after that, but you're going to accept. Everybody's accepting, but whatever. Client was at work, or I don't know, in surgery. Performing surgery, I'm thinking, not like, yeah, I don't know. If everybody agrees, you can change the time and initial and accept. You don't need to counter. You don't need to counter because there's nothing to counter, right? If all parties are willing, then we can look for those initials. But if I'm countering, I could counter just on the deposit. I could counter on condition dates. I could counter because the offer I received was the most clerically horrible thing I've ever seen, with a whole pile of mistakes or weird clauses, and I'm countering just on that. Countering is not just about price. So sometimes you'll get offers that they have this clause that wants you to like guarantee X or Y or whatever, or a warranty to survive closing for something, and you're like, I can't do that. So you can counter for any reason. Do not think that your counter is only about price. Your counter is because there is something in that agreement for which you are not accepting. The terms are not satisfactory. So my counter could be, they could ask for 6 weeks of condition dates. I like the price, but the condition dates are terrible. Does that make sense? So a counter is to change any term within the agreement. Don't think your counter is only about price. It could be closing date. Maybe you're not going to counter right away because your people have to find out if they have somewhere to go. And you can't find that answer out in the time frame they gave you to accept. But you're not going to accept anyway because you're not going to move out on that date. Oh, there's verbal communication. So let's go back to best practices for a second. Thank you, Anita. It's like I paid you or something. So in terms of best practices, if you're a selling agent and you are not going to be getting a counter back, now my personal advice is that you should still try to get your counter back within the time frame, because you will keep people from having hyperventilation and panic attacks who don't understand this, okay? But sometimes it's either not in your seller's best interest or it's just not possible, okay? So hang on 1 second, Shelley, I'll come back to you. So my recommendation is to still use that time frame as your recommended response time for whatever you're going to do, counter, acceptance, or not, okay? But if it's not, then it would be to communicate back with the agent. So I would call you, Anita, and say, you know, thank you so much for your offer. Clients are still debating a couple of things. They've got to make some calls. They've got to, you know, maybe I have permission to disclose that they need to talk to their bank, or I don't know, right? And I say, so we will be countering. And then I would say, because I'm that human, but I would say, so, and as you know, Anita, obviously I'm not going to assume that I'm going to treat her as if she's a super well-educated realtor. You know, there's no specific timeline for me to counter to you. So as soon as I have an answer, I will give you a shout and we'll get that counter over to you. I'm not going to just ignore the woman, which is what a lot of people do. And that's poor negotiation, that's poor practices, that's poor whatever. So, and then you're going to say, well, my offer was only open until 12, and I'm going to say, okay, well, you know, I'm 9,000% sure of this, and if you have a problem, you can have your broker call my broker. That's your answer to that, okay? Because it's not a problem. It was open to acceptance, but I can counter after, and regardless, I'm not accepting it anyway, so you can either play ball with me, or you got nothing, we're going to reject, because I can't accept it as it is. So really, you're in the driver's seat, okay? So Shelley's question is, what if your seller counters 2 days later and the buyers have moved on to another property? That can happen. That's why I'm suggesting that you don't just ignore people. And if I was countering 2 days later, I wouldn't not have been in communication with that agent. It would have been likely, maybe I need to talk to a lawyer. Maybe there's a third party out of the country and I can't officially answer you. So, you know, Like it wouldn't be that I just let you go. And that's why that communication, oh, Susan, I love this optimistic attitude. They've all learned it. I don't have a good answer. That would be the same as asking why you deal with agents who don't know that the inspection clause covers every inspection. I don't have an answer as to what people retain in their brains. Some brokers are more engaged. Thanks, Colette. More engaged. If anybody who calls the commission, like people will push back. Okay. And again, I'm not suggesting that you start running around not answering your deals within the preferred timelines that maximizes everybody's happiness with the transaction. I want you to understand two really important things. As a buyer's agent, I am recommending that you change the expectations with your buyers in terms of the response. In the saying that they can accept by X time. If they're going to counter, she or he will tell me, and I should be able to give you a ballpark timeline as to when that's going to happen. So now I'm changing my client's expectations. Nobody's stressed. Nobody's anxious. We haven't turned the whole thing sour. Everybody's good. And if I am a seller's agent, then I am aware of how I can use this to the advantage of my seller and their position. Okay? Does anybody have any other questions? Your brains are bleeding, I know.
How is this going to work for on the buyer side to make an advantage for the buyer? Let's say it's a hot listing and you know that there's going to be some people that are really interested in putting offers in. So it's like, how can you work? Because before we used to be able to shorten our time frame too for acceptance, because we said, well, we're only going to leave it open for this short period of time, right? But chances are, if there's anything else comes through the back door, if we have a shorter window, chances are we'll be the one in the door. Now we don't have that.
Well, we do in the sense, if you're dealing with a super hot property, in theory, you're going in with your A game to begin with that hopefully they'll accept, right? So you were never in the footing you thought you were if they countered. We just thought we were. So the reality is it's the seller's product, not the buyer's. It's their object to dispose of. And nobody can force a seller to dispose of their thing on terms they are not comfortable with, because they have way more vested interest than a buyer. Make sense? Yeah, not the answer you wanted, I know that. So I realize that this is a ton of information. So we are recording this class. I don't have no idea what it would sound like to listen to, but it is going to be recorded, and Erin will send it out and upload it on Weebly. The best advice that I can give you is I don't expect you to retain this and own this and understand this. I talk about this probably 2 to 3 times a week between all of you, and it's a regular conversation when I'm working on the audit task force and all kinds of things. So I'm talking about this all the time. The best thing I can suggest to you is just to reach out and to talk to me, let me help you when you're in this situation where you're not really sure what to do. And don't automatically assume if somebody says, well, I'm not going to counter right now, I'm going to counter in 2 hours. You need to take a breath because they're allowed to do that. Okay? So, and when you're the seller, you'll be really glad that you know this because you can protect your sellers and your buyers best if you actually understand the game that's being played. And that's why I wanted to have this class. Okay? So thank you, everybody. If you have other questions or something on a specific, you are welcome to reach out to me one-on-one. And the rest of you, I thank you so much for your time. That's it.
Anne,
Wait, yeah.
Anne,
Yep. Hi, Pat.
so to be clear, hi,
Hi.
there's no time limit on the counter.
None. Except the
okay.
risk that you can lose the buyers.
Yes, yeah.
Right? But there is
Okay,
no
perfect.
specific time. This is highly
Yeah.
unpopular when the other side doesn't know it. Okay? Probably keep the sellers as
Perfect.
clients. Yeah. Okay, guys. Anyway, let me know if you have more
Thanks.
questions. Have a wonderful day.